The words hit me like a slap across the face, but I didn't flinch. I stood there in Thomas's kitchen, watching my son's face contort with irritation as he gestured wildly at the mess his 3-year-old had made with cereal all over the floor. "Mom, I can't deal with this right now," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're always here, always in the way, always needing something. Maybe it's time you found yourself a nice nursing home where someone else can deal with your constant demands." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my granddaughter's innocent giggling from the living room. I felt my heart crack a little more, the way it had been cracking for years, piece by piece, with every dismissive comment, every rolled eye, every time he made me feel like a burden instead of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. I wanted to remind him of the sleepless nights I'd spent by his bedside when he had pneumonia at age 7, or the 3 jobs I'd worked to pay for his college tuition when his father walked out on us. I wanted to tell him about the countless times I'd bitten my tongue when his wife Sarah made snide comments about my old-fashioned ways, or how I'd pretended not to notice when they forgot my birthday 3 years running. But instead, I just nodded slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my purse on the counter. "Of course, dear," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the hum of their expensive refrigerator. "I understand you're busy." The words tasted bitter in my mouth, like medicine I'd been forced to swallow for far too long. I could see Sarah in the doorway, her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth as if she'd finally won some invisible war she'd been waging against me. As I walked toward the front door of their beautiful 2-story home in the heart of Abilene, I couldn't help but notice how perfectly everything was arranged. The hardwood floors gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay windows, and the crown molding I'd admired so many times before seemed to mock me now with its elegant perfection. This house had always felt like a symbol of Thomas's success, his achievement, his independence from the woman who had raised him in a cramped apartment above the old diner on South First Street. I remembered how proud he'd been when he'd called to tell me about finding this place, how he'd described every detail with the excitement of a child on Christmas morning. "It's perfect, Mom," he'd said then, his voice full of joy. "Sarah and I are finally going to have the life we've always dreamed of." Now, as I reached for the brass doorknob, that same house felt like a fortress designed to keep me out. The drive home to my small cottage on Elm Street felt longer than usual, every red light giving me more time to replay Thomas's words in my mind. I gripped the steering wheel of my old Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving for 12 years, because I'd never seen the need to replace something that still worked perfectly fine. The radio played some cheerful country song about family and forgiveness, but I reached over and turned it off, preferring the silence to the cruel irony of the lyrics. Through my windshield, I watched other families going about their Sunday afternoon routines. Children playing in front yards while their parents watched from porches, grandparents pushing strollers down tree-lined sidewalks. I wondered if any of those grandparents had ever been told they should rot in a nursing home by the children they'd devoted their lives to raising. The thought made my chest tighten with a familiar ache that had become my constant companion over the past few years. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the modest white house that had been my sanctuary for the past 15 years. The garden I'd carefully tended was in full bloom, with roses climbing the trellis by the front porch and marigolds lining the walkway in neat, colorful rows. This little house had witnessed my transformation from a struggling single mother to a woman who had quietly built something meaningful with her life, though my son had never bothered to ask about the details. Inside these walls, I'd made countless phone calls, signed numerous documents, and made decisions that would have surprised Thomas if he'd ever shown enough interest to inquire about my daily activities. But he'd always assumed that his old mother was just getting by on Social Security and the small inheritance from his grandmother, never imagining that I might have been busy creating something substantial while he was building his own life. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the familiar comfort of my living room, where family photos lined the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Most of them featured Thomas at various stages of his life: his high school graduation, his wedding day, the birth of his daughter. In every single photo, I was smiling, my arm around him or my granddaughter, my face radiating the kind of unconditional love that only a mother can feel. But looking at those pictures now, I realized something that made my heart sink even further. In none of them did Thomas look genuinely happy to be standing next to me. His smiles were polite, dutiful, the kind you give to distant relatives at family reunions. When had I become a stranger to my own son? When had my presence in his life shifted from welcome to tolerated to apparently completely unwanted? I walked to my small home office, a converted bedroom where I kept my important papers organized in neat filing cabinets that Thomas had never bothered to notice during his rare visits. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across my mahogany desk where I conducted the business that had quietly sustained me for years. I pulled out a particular folder, one that contained documents that would have shocked my son if he'd ever taken the time to ask about my financial situation. Inside were property deeds, rental agreements, and bank statements that told the story of a woman who had learned to be resourceful and independent long before it became fashionable. My fingers traced the edges of papers that represented years of careful planning, strategic investments, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from knowing you can only rely on yourself. As evening approached and the shadows grew longer across my hardwood floors, I made myself a simple dinner and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Thomas with his homework so many years ago. The silence in my house felt different tonight, heavier somehow, weighted with the realization that my relationship with my son had reached a breaking point I'd been trying to avoid for years. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the moments I'd chosen peace over pride, all the occasions when I'd accepted his indifference rather than demand the respect I deserved. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, and perhaps it was time for Thomas to learn that his quiet, unassuming mother had more strength and resources than he'd ever bothered to discover. The woman he'd dismissed so casually today was about to remind him that respect isn't just given. Sometimes it has to be earned, and sometimes it has to be demanded. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Abilene feel like a postcard, but I barely noticed the beauty of the changing leaves as I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee and the stack of papers I'd retrieved from my office the night before. My hands were steadier than they'd been in months as I reviewed the documents that would change everything between Thomas and me forever. The rental agreement bore his signature in that confident scrawl I'd watched him develop since childhood, the same handwriting that had once spelled out, "I love you, Mom," in crayon on homemade Mother's Day cards. Now that signature represented a legal obligation he'd never connected to the woman he'd told to rot in a nursing home just 24 hours earlier. I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring both the warmth and the bitter irony of the situation, as I prepared to make a phone call that would shatter my son's comfortable assumptions about his independent life. I had purchased the property on Maple Street 5 years ago, back when Thomas and Sarah were still renting a cramped apartment across town and complaining constantly about their landlord's neglect and the rising cost of rent in Abilene. They'd been so excited when they found the listing for the beautiful 2-story house with the wraparound porch and the big backyard perfect for children. "It's like a dream come true, Mom," Thomas had told me over dinner at the diner where I used to work, his eyes bright with the kind of hope I hadn't seen in him since he was young. "The owner is some investment company, and they're being really reasonable about the rent. We can actually afford to live somewhere nice for once." I'd smiled and nodded, asking all the right questions about square footage and school districts, never mentioning that I was the silent partner in that investment company, never revealing that I'd specifically chosen that property because I knew it would be perfect for my son's growing family. The decision to remain anonymous had been deliberate and carefully considered, born from years of watching Thomas struggle with his pride and his need to prove his independence. Even as a teenager, he'd bristled whenever I tried to help him financially, insisting that he could handle his own problems and didn't need his mother's charity. When he'd graduated from college and started his career in insurance, he'd made it clear that he wanted to build his own life without what he called handouts from family. So I'd found a way to help him without bruising his ego, creating a paper trail that led to a property management company that led to an investment firm that eventually, if anyone cared to dig deep enough, led back to Dorothy Henderson, The woman he'd just told should disappear into institutional care. For 5 years, I'd watched him take pride in his beautiful home, never knowing that his mother's love and financial acumen had made it possible. The property management company I'd hired to handle the day-to-day operations had been professional and discreet, exactly as I'd requested when I'd set up this arrangement. They collected the rent, handled maintenance requests, and dealt with any issues that arose, all while keeping my identity completely confidential. Thomas had no idea that when he called to report a leaky faucet or request permission to paint his daughter's bedroom, those requests were ultimately being approved by the woman he saw as a burden. I'd even driven by the house occasionally, just to see him working in the yard or playing with little Emma on the front porch, my heart swelling with pride at the life he'd built in the home I'd provided. Those stolen moments of watching my son's happiness from a distance had been worth every penny I'd invested, every complicated legal arrangement I'd navigated, every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about whether I was doing the right thing. But now, as I dialed the number for Henderson Property Management, the company I'd named after myself in a moment of quiet humor, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination that surprised me with its intensity. "Good morning, this is Dorothy Henderson," I said when my property manager, Janet, answered the phone. "I need you to prepare a notice for the tenants at 1247 Maple Street. Effective immediately, I'm terminating their lease agreement." Janet's surprised silence stretched for several seconds before she found her voice. "Mrs. Henderson, is there a problem with the tenants? They've been model renters for 5 years, never late with payments, always respectful of the property." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was about to do settle across my shoulders like a heavy shawl. "No, Janet, there's no problem with their tenancy. This is a personal matter that requires immediate attention. Please prepare the standard 30-day notice and have it delivered today." The conversation with Janet lasted another 10 minutes as we discussed the legal requirements and logistics of the eviction notice. But my mind kept drifting to the moment when Thomas would open that envelope and see my name printed clearly at the bottom of the document. I wondered if he would recognize the irony immediately, or if it would take him several readings to understand that the mother he'd dismissed so cruelly was actually the foundation upon which his comfortable life had been built. Part of me hoped he would call immediately, full of apologies and newfound respect, but a larger part of me suspected that his first reaction would be anger and accusations rather than gratitude and remorse. After all, this was the same man who had somehow convinced himself that his aging mother was nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person deserving of basic respect and consideration. As I hung up the phone, I walked to my living room window and looked out at the quiet street where I'd lived peacefully for so many years, building my small real estate portfolio and managing my investments, while my son assumed I was just another elderly woman living on a fixed income. The morning sun cast long shadows across my front yard, and I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door tending to her flower garden, probably wondering why I was up and about so early on a Tuesday morning. If she only knew that I was in the process of upending my son's entire world, she might have offered to bring me a cup of tea and a sympathetic ear. But this was something I had to do alone, just as I'd done everything else important in my life since Thomas's father had walked away when our son was barely 10 years old. The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze of ordinary activities that felt anything but ordinary given what I'd set in motion. I watered my plants, sorted through my mail, and even baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies, Thomas's favorite since childhood, though I had no intention of delivering them to him this time. Instead, I wrapped them carefully and put them in my freezer, a small act of hope that perhaps someday we might sit together again and share them while having the kind of honest conversation we should have had years ago. By noon, I knew that Janet would have delivered the notice, and somewhere across town, my son was about to discover that the mother he'd tried to discard was actually the person who held the keys to his kingdom. The thought should have brought me satisfaction, but instead, it just made me feel incredibly, profoundly sad. The call came at exactly 2:47 p.m., and I let it ring 4 times before answering, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread that I hadn't felt since the day I'd waited for Thomas's college acceptance letters to arrive in the mail. "Mom?" His voice was different than it had been yesterday, higher, strained, with an edge of panic that I'd never heard before, not even when he'd called to tell me about his car accident 3 years ago. "Mom, I need to talk to you. There's been some kind of mistake, some mix-up with our house." I could hear Sarah in the background, her voice sharp and demanding, asking him what I was saying, whether I knew anything about this ridiculous notice they'd received. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the conversation I'd been both dreading and anticipating since I'd made that call to Janet this morning. "Hello, Thomas," I said quietly, my voice calmer than I felt. "What seems to be the problem?" "The problem?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could picture him pacing around that beautiful kitchen where he'd told me to rot in a nursing home just 24 hours earlier. "The problem is that we just got an eviction notice from someone named Dorothy Henderson, and it says we have 30 days to vacate the premises. But that's impossible, Mom, because our landlord is some investment company, not a person named Dorothy Henderson." The silence that followed was heavy with implications, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind as he began to process the significance of that name. "Thomas," I said gently, "Dorothy Henderson is my name. Dorothy is my first name, and Henderson was my maiden name, the name I used when I started my business 15 years ago." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me that the first piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, but I could tell he was still struggling to understand the full scope of what this meant. "Your business?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what business? You worked at the diner until you retired, and then we always thought you were just getting by on Social Security and Grandma's inheritance." I could hear the confusion and growing realization in his voice, and part of me wanted to spare him the full truth, to find some gentle way to explain how wrong he'd been about his mother's capabilities and resources. But another part of me, the part that had been wounded by years of dismissive treatment and casual disrespect, wanted him to understand exactly how much he'd underestimated the woman who had raised him. "I've been investing in real estate for 15 years, Thomas," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I own 12 properties in Abilene, including the house you've been living in for the past 5 years. The house where you told me yesterday that I should rot in a nursing home." The silence that followed was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. But then I heard Sarah's voice in the background, demanding to know what was happening, why Thomas looked like he'd seen a ghost. "You own our house?" he finally managed to say, his voice hollow with disbelief. "You've owned our house this whole time, and you never told us?" I could hear the accusation creeping into his tone, the familiar pattern of making himself the victim even when he was clearly in the wrong. "I wanted you to have a beautiful home for your family," I explained, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes despite my determination to remain strong. "You were so proud of your independence, so determined to make it on your own, and I knew you'd never accept help directly from me. So I found a way to help you without hurting your pride." The irony wasn't lost on me that my attempt to preserve his dignity had ultimately led to him treating me with such casual cruelty. "But why now?" he asked, and I could hear genuine confusion in his voice, as if he couldn't possibly connect his behavior yesterday with the consequences he was facing today. "Why are you doing this now, Mom? If you've been helping us all along, why would you suddenly want to kick us out?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was the moment when I had to decide whether to be the understanding mother who always forgave and forgot, or the woman who finally demanded the respect she deserved. "Because yesterday, Thomas, you told me I should rot in a nursing home," I said, my voice steady despite the pain those words still caused me. "You told me I was always in the way, always needing something, always being a burden. You made it clear that you don't want me in your life, so I'm simply giving you what you asked for, complete independence from your mother." I could hear him struggling to find words, probably realizing for the first time that his casual cruelty had real consequences, that the mother he'd taken for granted wasn't as powerless as he'd assumed. "Mom, I didn't mean... I was just frustrated. You know how stressful things have been with work and Emma and everything." His voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuses sounded, how inadequate they were in the face of what he'd said and done. "Stress doesn't excuse cruelty, Thomas," I replied, feeling a strength I hadn't known I possessed flowing through my voice. "I've been stressed plenty of times in my life. When your father left us, When I was working 3 jobs to put you through college, when I was building my business from nothing while trying to be the mother you needed. But I never once told you that you should be forgotten somewhere, that you were a burden I didn't want to carry. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Thomas alternating between apologies, accusations, and desperate attempts to understand how his quiet, unassuming mother had managed to build a real estate empire right under his nose. He wanted to know about the other properties, about how much money I had, about why I'd never told him about my success. But with each question, I could hear that he was still thinking about what this meant for him, rather than truly understanding what his behavior had cost our relationship. "The eviction notice stands, Thomas," I said finally, when it became clear that he was more concerned about his housing situation than about the pain he'd caused me. "You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. I'm sure a successful, independent man like yourself will have no trouble securing appropriate housing for his family." The words tasted bitter, but they needed to be said. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I was trembling. Not with fear or regret, but with a strange mixture of liberation and grief that I'd never experienced before. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I had stood up for myself, had demanded to be treated with dignity and respect. But the cost of that stand was the relationship with my son, and I wasn't sure yet whether the price had been worth paying. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the bird feeder I'd hung there last spring, watching a cardinal pick at the seeds while his mate waited patiently on a nearby branch. Even the birds, I thought sadly, seemed to understand the importance of treating their partners with care and consideration. If only my son had learned that lesson, as well as the creatures in my backyard. The next few days passed in a surreal blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from making decisions that change everything you thought you knew about your life. Thomas called 6 more times, each conversation following the same predictable pattern. Initial anger, followed by bargaining, then desperate attempts to make me understand how unfair I was being to his family. During our 4th conversation, Sarah got on the phone, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness she'd perfected over the years. "Dorothy, surely you don't want to put your own granddaughter out on the street," she said, as if I hadn't been watching them take Emma to expensive restaurants and designer clothing stores, while claiming they couldn't afford to visit me more than twice a year. On the 15th day after I'd served the eviction notice, Thomas showed up at my front door unannounced, looking haggard and desperate in a way I'd never seen before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. "Mom, please," he said before I'd even fully opened the door. "We need to talk. Really talk this time. I've been thinking about everything you said, about how I've treated you, and I think I'm finally starting to understand." What I saw in his face was a mixture of desperation and something that might have been the beginning of real self-awareness, the first crack in the wall of indifference he'd built around his heart. I invited Thomas in and made coffee, the same ritual we'd shared countless times over the years. But everything felt different now. The power dynamic had shifted in ways that neither of us fully understood yet, and we were both trying to navigate this new territory carefully. "I called Grandma Henderson's old neighbors in Oklahoma," he said suddenly, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug as if it were an anchor. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the one who lived next door to Grandma for 40 years. She told me things I never knew, Mom, about how you sent Grandma money every month, how you paid for her medical bills, how you made sure she could stay in her own house until the end." His voice cracked slightly, and I could see tears gathering in his eyes as the full scope of my sacrifices began to dawn on him for the first time. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, the longest real conversation we'd had in years, with Thomas finally understanding the woman his mother had become while he wasn't paying attention. He told me about the pressure he'd been feeling at work, about his fears of not being a good enough provider for his family, about how my frequent visits had somehow become a reminder of his own insecurities rather than a source of comfort and connection. I told him about the loneliness I'd been carrying, about how his dismissive treatment had made me feel invisible and unwanted, about the years I'd spent building my business partly as a way to ensure I'd never be a burden to anyone. We both cried, we both apologized, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was talking to my son rather than to a stranger who happened to share my DNA. But even as we reconnected emotionally, I knew that some things couldn't be undone with words alone, that trust, once broken, requires time and consistent action to rebuild. The eviction notice would stand, but perhaps we could begin building something new from the ashes of what we'd lost. 3 months later, Thomas and his family found a beautiful rental house across town, one they could afford on their own without any hidden assistance from me. He calls me twice a week now, not because he needs something, but because he wants to hear my voice and share the details of his life that he'd kept hidden for so long. Last Sunday, he brought Emma over to help me plant bulbs in my garden, and as I watched my granddaughter's small hands carefully placing tulip bulbs in the rich soil, I realized that sometimes the most painful lessons are also the most necessary ones. Thomas has learned to see me as a whole person rather than just his mother, and I've learned that demanding respect doesn't make you heartless. It makes you human. The house on Maple Street now has new tenants, a young couple with their first baby, and sometimes when I drive by, I smile knowing that love lives there again. My relationship with Thomas will never be the same as it was before, but perhaps that's exactly what we both needed. A chance to build something real and honest instead of something built on assumptions and unspoken resentments.